I have to admit, as I was preparing for this study, I was wondering if anybody would notice if I just skipped over chapter 13. It is a complicated chapter. The heading, if you look at the NIV, at least my NIV, kind of parallels verse 1. It says, a prophecy against Babylon. And with chapter 13, we are moving into the next section of Isaiah. These next 11 chapters, 13 through 23, Isaiah is beginning to put forth prophecies against the kingdoms that are surrounding Judah and Jerusalem. And he picks for the first, or the Lord told him to pick for the first of these oracles or prophecies, Babylon. And Babylon is an intriguing choice. And the reason I say that is because Babylon at the time of Isaiah, during his lifetime, was a significant but rather minor city of the Assyrian Empire. Chapter 13, verse 1, a prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. That's the easy part of the chapter. Where it gets complicated, and one of the things I discovered as I was going through the commentaries, is that the scholars can't seem to agree exactly what this prophecy is about. Some see it as a prophecy against Babylon as it existed in Isaiah's time. Some see it as a prophecy against the Babylon which came in and destroyed Judah and Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar. And I thought that perhaps the best place to start would be looking at exactly what we mean when we talk about Babylon. When we see Babylon referenced, what are we talking about? There's some thought that the origin of Babylon goes back, all the way back into the book of Genesis, to the story about the Tower of Babel. That the city of Babel, where the tower was built, founded by Nimrod, and this is where the roots of the city that we know as in biblical times as Babylon began. And of course, the Tower of Babel is where the confusion of languages happened. Then Babylon, or Babel, kind of fades into obscurity until we reach the time of Hammurabi. It was a center, it was a city-state, but it was under Hammurabi that Babylon first rose to prominence. Of course, we're all familiar with the Code of Hammurabi, and he made major reforms, and he built Babylon into a powerful empire during his reign, but it pretty much fell apart after his death and sank back into near obscurity and kind of remained there until we start coming into this period of the Assyrian Empire. By the time we come into Isaiah's day, like I said, it's a significant city, but a rather unimportant city within the Assyrian Empire, except for the fact that by the time of Tiglath-Pileser, Babylon is wanting to be separated from Assyria. So they are in a state of rebellion throughout much of this history that we're seeing here during the time of Isaiah. They rebel, the king goes down, subdues the rebellion, and then basically goes and focuses on Israel and Judah. And they rebel, and you see the pattern. Eventually, under Sennacherib, who was the king that was trying to conquer Judah and Jerusalem, it was his army that the angel of the Lord came and slew 185,000 men on that fateful night. But it was under Sennacherib when he got tired of the rebellion in Babylon, and he went in and razed the city. And there's some thought that this is the judgment being talked about here in chapter 13. Well, as we all know, Sennacherib passes on, and his son, Esarhaddon, once he becomes king, decides it would be a good thing to rebuild Babylon. So he does so. And shortly thereafter, a general by the name of Nabopolassar rises up and overthrows the Assyrians. Nabopolassar's son was Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, it's under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar that Babylon becomes one of the greatest empires of this period in history. And of course, it's Nebuchadnezzar who eventually comes in and destroys Judah, destroys Jerusalem, and razes the temple. And like I said, some scholars think this is the judgment, or this is the catalyst that starts the judgment against Babylon that Isaiah is talking about here in chapter 13. There's one other piece of this, because Babylon represents more than just a physical city or a physical empire, because we also see Babylon talked about in terms of its spiritual side. If in fact Babel under Nimrod was the origin of Babylon, from its very beginnings, Babylon was also a major center of pagan religions. And this is what we see Babylon often representing when it's talked about, is these ungodly, anti-God, if you will, religions that grew up out of the ancient Sumerian culture into what Babylon was at the time of Isaiah. And of course, in the book of Revelation, we see discussion of the whore of Babylon, the spiritual Babylon, which represents all the false religions of the world standing in opposition to the Jewish people and to the tribulation Christians. And it also represents the physical enemies of God. Because we also see in the book of Revelation, in the future, there's a secular government called Babylon. And I believe this then represents the physical enemies of God. So when we talk about Babylon, it can mean any one of these four things: the city, the empire, the religious side, or the physical enemies of God. And I think what we're seeing as we come into chapter 13, and I think part of the reason there's such, if you will, difficulty in trying to figure out what's going on here by the scholars that are studying this, is that they're trying to see Babylon in just one of these iterations. And I think we're seeing Babylon here in all four of these iterations. So you with me? Okay. Isaiah 13, verse 1. A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. Raise a banner on a bare hilltop. Shout to them. Beckon to them to enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded those I prepared for battle. I have summoned my warriors to carry out my wrath, those who rejoice in my triumph. Listen, a noise on the mountains like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath, to destroy the whole country. So verse 1 sets the stage, a prophecy against Babylon. And then I believe what we're seeing as we then move through verses 2 through 5 here is the Lord's call to Babylon to begin their march against Judah and Jerusalem. As verse 5 states, they come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens. And then it says, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Now, if you remember, God used Assyria as his instrument of judgment against Ephraim, the northern kingdom. God often would use the enemies of Israel, both north and south, as his instruments of judgment. And again, we've talked about this. We see that going back into the book of Judges, the number of times Moab and Edom and so forth would come against Israel when they'd done evil in the eyes of the Lord. And I think that's what we're seeing here. God is now calling Babylon to amass its army to come in and be his instrument of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem because of the idolatry that has become so prevalent in Jerusalem. This is his judgment against that. As God judged Assyria for their treatment of Ephraim, as we now move into chapter 13, starting in verse 6, we begin to see God's judgment against Babylon for their treatment of Judah and Jerusalem. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. And I think what we see here is the beginning of God's judgments against Babylon for their treatment of the children of Israel, the remaining children of Israel from the southern kingdom. Now, the day of the Lord usually refers to the time of what we call the end of days, the time when Messiah will have come. We've been into and through the tribulation. Messiah is setting up his earthly kingdom. And in part, I believe that is still the case here. But because we see this phrase again when we get into verse 9, I think we're also seeing this phrase, the day of the Lord, referring to a much closer time, the day of the Lord against Babylon. So verse 9 says, "See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger." So here, when we see the day of the Lord, I think we're now looking at that period, the end of days, when the judgments of God are going to fall generally on the earth. And are going to fall generally on the earth because the people of the earth have taken on the characteristics of spiritual Babylon and physical Babylon as the enemies of God. The judgments coming, we see parallels, I think, in what we've just looked at here in chapter 13, in some of the things we see Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, and also in the book of Revelation. And I think that's why we're seeing a split, a judgment against Babylon short term, and then here starting in verse 9, a judgment against Babylon distant future. And one of the issues in prophecy, trying to interpret prophecy, sometimes are these parallels that you see that are kind of hard to distinguish until you start looking at some of the historical context. The parallels here, the imagery, the stars not giving their light, the sun and moon being darkened, the heavens and the earth trembling as a result of the Lord's wrath being played out. And then down into verse 11, I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. Again, judgments coming against what Babylon represents. And into verse 12, I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. And I see this as paralleling what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse. This is Matthew 24, verse 22. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. The people being scarcer than gold, I see as a reference to the fact that there's so much death that gold has become a greater resource, more prevalent than those that have survived these judgments of God. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. So this coming judgment is against the world. As we see in what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, what John described in the book of Revelation, these judgments are coming against the wickedness, against the idolatry, against this total abandonment of God in the last days. Gold will be more abundant than people. Think about that. Then into verse 14, like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. All who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted, and their wives violated. I think we could be looking back here on what happened when Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered Judah and Jerusalem. Remember, under the Assyrian kings, Judah had become a client state to Assyria. When Nabopolassar and ultimately Nebuchadnezzar basically overthrew the Assyrians, they laid claim to Jerusalem and Judah. Now, Jerusalem was divided as to whether or not they wanted to be under Pharaoh in Egypt or Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So there was a fight between the two. Nebuchadnezzar won. And remember, there were 3 deportations from Judah and Jerusalem to Babylon. The first, basically, is when Nebuchadnezzar came in, made Judah a client state, and deported the elite, if you will, the religious leaders, the military leaders, the secular leaders, and took them to Babylon, the city, the Babylon itself. And of course, this is the deportation in which we saw Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Of course, we know them more as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that's the deportation where these 4 men, along with the other scholars and so forth, were taken, basically the upper fringes of Judean society, carried into Babylon. The second deportation happened because Jerusalem and Judah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. I think he had lost a battle to the Pharaoh in Egypt. I want to say it was Necho. So Babylon comes in, subdues Jerusalem again. This time they pillage Jerusalem. This is when Nebuchadnezzar takes the treasures of the temple back to Babylon. And this is the settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River. This is when Ezekiel was carried off. And Ezekiel's prophecy happened from this settlement on the Euphrates. Then the third deportation happens when there's a third rebellion, or I guess a second rebellion, against Babylon. And this time Nebuchadnezzar is finished. He comes in, he razes the city, he destroys the temple, and he carries off what he can of the remaining Jewish people into slavery. And this is the group, those that survive, who decide they're going to run down to Egypt with Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah has said, don't do this. This is our home. This is where we belong. This is where God has put us. So it's only going to be 70 years. We should stay right here. And they said, no, we're going to go to Egypt. We're going to take you with us. And of course, Jeremiah says, I don't want to go. And they say to Jeremiah, well, we want you to come with us because you're a prophet of God and we want God with us, even though they'd never listened to Jeremiah once during his ministry. So anyway, that's what we're seeing happening. And that's what's left of Judah and Jerusalem, which basically at this point is a pile of rubble. So, into verse 17, see, I will stir up against them, Babylon, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. The Medes, or the Medo-Persians, probably did care a little bit for gold and silver. What I believe this is referencing is that at the time, an attacking army that was laying siege to your city could occasionally be bought off, bribed, if you will, with silver and gold. And I think what we're seeing here is the Medo-Persians coming in. Once they decided they were going to take your city, they were going to take your city. And I think what we're seeing described here with the Medes or the Medo-Persians coming against Babylon is then that judgment that comes against Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's death, when one of his, I don't think there was a direct descendant, I think there was a usurpation in there someplace, but this is when Belshazzar is having that party and decides to use the vessels from the temple to drink and so forth, basically to mock God. And we see in the 5th chapter of Daniel the handwriting on the wall, many, many tekel, upharsim. And of course, you've been judged in the balance and been found wanting. Tonight your kingdom will end, is the interpretation Daniel gives Belshazzar. And rather than take the warning, he says, "Great, we know what it means. Let's drink to that." Now, the Medes and the Persians had laid siege to Babylon, at least according to some reports of the time. They had laid siege to Babylon. And if you have ever read the descriptions of what the city was like, it was massive. There was a wall, an inner wall and an outer wall, and filled in with rubble, and it was something like 60 feet thick. They described being able to drive, a half dozen chariots, full speed around the wall. It was that thick. And it was built on the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city Nebuchadnezzar had built. It also formed a wide moat around the city. So it was not an easy place to try and conquer. And according to, like I said, some historical accounts, the Medes and Persians had laid siege to the city for some time, until someone came up with the bright idea, and according to some reports, it was a soldier who'd been kicked out of the Babylonian army, came up with the grand idea of simply diverting the Euphrates River to dry up the riverbed. And then were able to walk under the wall. And again, according to this report or this account at the time, the city was basically taken without a fight. As then over the next several centuries, we see Babylon begin to fall into that place it had been, becoming less and less important, less and less significant, until finally, several centuries later, there's nothing left but rubble. Now, we know where Babylon was. They are doing archaeological excavations at the site now. And if you remember, one of the things Saddam Hussein wanted to do was rebuild Babylon to the glory it had known under Nebuchadnezzar. He was trying to recreate the Hanging Gardens. And as we know, that didn't go well for him. That brings us to verse 19. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. There no nomads will pitch their tents, and no shepherds will rest their flocks. But desert creatures will lie there, jackals will fill her houses. There the owls will dwell, and there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will inhabit her strongholds, jackals her luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand. Her days will not be prolonged. And that pretty much describes what Babylon is today. It is archaeological ruins. And I think it speaks to the ultimate fate of Hussein that he was trying to rebuild it and failed. Essentially, what Isaiah saw in this prophecy, or is giving us in this prophecy against Babylon. Remember, this was a relatively minor city in his day. It would not have been seen as anything approaching a world power that could do the kinds of things he describes it doing when it comes against, in one sense, Assyria, but eventually against Judah and Jerusalem. And what Isaiah is giving us, I believe, is this long view of what Babylon is in the fullness of what I described earlier. A physical city, a physical empire, a spiritual representation of all of the religions in opposition to God, and a spiritual, physical representation of all of those who stand in opposition to God. That's what we're seeing. And that's what eventually will be overthrown. The physical Babylon overthrown, and then eventually the mystery religions out of Babylon, the secular forces out of Babylon as we come into that tribulation period we talked about in our study of Revelation, will be overthrown and will be no more. There are more judgments coming against Babylon in chapter 14. Plus, we're going to meet an old friend. And I use that term very loosely. That will be next week. Any questions? Okay. Thank you.